Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's event. 5 years ago, the UK was already in lockdown, and around that time, quite a lot of commentary and commentators were predicting the demise of the office in a narrow sense, but also the hollowing out of cities and what that meant. 5 years on, it's obvious that cities haven't hollowed out. City populations have continued to grow after a very small decline in 2020. The office endures. The time workers spend in their offices is now around 70% of the February 2020 level. And public ridership in our bigger cities is around the 80% pre-pandemic levels as well. But cities certainly have changed. And I think in some respects, in more interesting and more nuanced ways than some of those more dramatic comments at the very start in 2020. Our latest briefing, published last week and available on our website, does show that hybrid working has changed the way that we go out in our city centres up and down the country. So that's going to be the initial focus of our event. So in a moment, my colleague, Oscar Selby, and author of the briefing, is going to take us through some slides setting out that briefing. And then I'm going to be joined by my colleague, Paul Swinney. We're going to sort of set that briefing in a broader context around some of the other work that we've been doing over the last few years, just looking at what's been happening in cities, both in the UK, but also internationally, about how they've responded to the changes that have happened as a result of COVID. So we'll do that. As always, questions and answers, put them in the Q&A function. We'd love to hear your questions for either me, for Paul, or for Oscar, or just your comments or queries or questions or points of view on the things that you've observed over the last 5 years, and we'll take them in due course. So without further ado, Oscar, over to you. Take us through our latest briefing.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm just going to share my screen so you guys can see the presentation. Hopefully that's all good and working. So yeah, as alluded to, I'm going to run us through some of the charts and the analysis that's come out of our most recent briefing, titled The Impact of Hybrid Working on the High Street. So this predominantly uses credit card transaction data, this enormous data set that Fable Data have provided us with. This has hundreds of millions of transactions and around 500,000 users in it. We've had to restrict that sample size down, though, to a slightly smaller number so that we can look at people who have consistent spending patterns in the city centre that would indicate that they are city centre workers, because that's really what we're interested in the impact of hybrid spending. So the first chart I'm going to show you is not actually in the briefing, but I think is helpful in providing some context. This chart shows the change in TfL, peak time, tube tap outs since the pandemic. So it shows this number as a share of pre-pandemic levels. So if you look at the beginning of the pandemic, around 2022, there's a massive drop off. You have lockdowns, peak COVID, everyone's saying the city's dying, it's never going to come back. People are going to be working remotely from full time. And then gradually, as the pandemic eases, as the vaccines come in, we see a return to the office and a slow increase in ridership. This then comes into about 75–80% of pre-COVID levels at around 2024, which is sort of where we're at now, which is much closer to where we were before than some people predicted, but is still not quite at pre-pandemic levels. There has been a change in behaviors, and this is driven, as we're all aware, by the rise in hybrid work, and particularly the rise in hybrid work on Mondays and Fridays. So this first chart from our briefing is a map of all the high streets in London. It shows the change in the share of all spending that each high street takes in since COVID. So we can see that the purple high streets are places that have seen a decline in the share of spending that they take in. And then the green high streets are the places that have seen an increase in the share of spending they take in. Most of the places that are purple are in the city centre. This is the areas where there are the most offices, where people would have been working, that are dominated by commercial real estate rather than residential. Most of the places that are green are more suburban, they're more residential, they're the local areas that people live. There are some exceptions to this. You can see up in northwest London around Watford, And then down in southwest London, around Woking, for example, there are some purple places where there's been a decline in the share of spending they take in. This is probably because these areas sort of function as de facto town centres within their local place. So these places do actually have quite a large share of commercial real estate compared to residential, and are therefore seeing the knock-on effects of hybrid working, sorry. We managed to find the same trend with Manchester. So these are all the high streets in Manchester. It's a little bit difficult to read sometimes, but what you can see is that the city centre is very dark purple. There's been a decline of almost 3% in spending, in the share of spending that they take in, whilst again, the suburban areas tend to have grown. There's also a significant increase around the Trafford Centre. We think this is probably due to some new development that's occurred since COVID, which is sort of skewing the figures. These two charts show a similar thing. They show the change in the location of worker spending throughout the week. So the chart on the left is of London, and the chart on the right is of the next 9 largest cities in the UK aggregated. We couldn't look at them individually because the sample sizes were too small, so we thought it was better and more representative to look at them as a cohesive chunk. What we find in the two charts is, well, first I'll explain that the purple lines are city centre spend, and the green lines are spend in the share of spend that happens locally. We define this as within 2 kilometres of where the worker lives. The darker lines are current levels, and the lighter lines are pre-COVID levels. So what we see with the city centre spend, or the purple lines, is a shift downwards. So there's a decrease in spend. This happens in both charts. And what we find in the green lines is there's a shift upwards. So there's an increase in spend. So we've seen a fall in city centre spend, and we've seen a rise in local spend. Interestingly, though, what this chart reveals is that the increase in local spend, or spend within 2 kilometres of residents' homes, of workers' homes, is not as much as the decrease in city centre spend. This means that before the pandemic, the worker that on a Friday might have been going out to prep for lunch isn't necessarily going out to their local sandwich bar while they're working from home on Friday. It's not perfectly offsetting it. So we think there's probably been a decrease in spending. We tried to investigate this question further with these charts. Unfortunately, the 2019 data set that we had didn't allow for a consistent sample to 2024. So we couldn't get a pre-COVID baseline. What we could do, though, is look at 2022 as the baseline and 2024 as our current year. And we looked at the overall growth in spending by location. So the light green bars here are the city centre growth, and the dark green bars are the local spend growth. Again, chart on the left is London, chart on the right is the next 9 largest cities aggregated. So what we find is that weekday spend in the city centre, as the pandemic has finished and as we have returned to the office, has actually seen a resurgence. So it is coming back. We see this particularly in London, where Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday all have a faster growth in city centre spend than they do in local spend. This is the case as well in the next 9 largest cities on Mondays, Thursdays, and Fridays. But interestingly, though, Tuesdays and Wednesdays are still seeing a faster growth in local spend. Okay, again, these two charts are the one on the left is of London, the one on the right is of the next 9 largest cities. But what this does is these show the change in the distribution of spend across the week for city centre workers in the city centre. So the light green is 2019, so pre-COVID, and the dark green is post-COVID. Across both London and the next 9 largest cities, we've seen a shift away from Fridays. So this is likely driven by the fact that hybrid working tends to mean that people work from home on Fridays. There's less city centre workers in the city centre. They tend to be within their local area. So in London, this shift away from Fridays has gone towards Thursdays, whilst outside of London, the shift away from Thursdays has actually gone towards the weekends. So we can see that Saturday is now the most popular day in the next 9 largest cities, whilst Thursday is the most popular day in London. We find this pattern's also the case for pubs and bars. So I think I'm sure a lot of you, maybe who are working in London, would notice that on Thursdays, when you leave the office, Thursdays tend to be bustling. There's lots of people out in the streets drinking. It's pretty popular. And it seems like the Friday night drink, which did exist before COVID, as you can see with the green line on the left, has actually shifted towards Thursdays, and Thursdays are now the most popular day. Interestingly, though, outside of London and the next 9 largest cities, there seems to have been a shift away from weekdays altogether, and now city centre spend is much more prominent on the weekend. And then finally, food and restaurant spend tends to show this exact same pattern. So again, a move away from Fridays towards Thursdays in London, but towards the weekends outside of London. So this is fast food, restaurants, but also includes your meal deal as well, for example. So in summary, workers now do less of their spending in city centres than they did in 2019. But this hasn't been to the overwhelming benefit of local high streets. There hasn't been a perfect shift away from the city centre and towards the local high streets. We also know that the Friday night drink, as well as the Friday night dinner, has shifted to Thursdays in London and become less popular in big cities outside the capital. And then I think the overall implication of the research that we're doing is this idea that the fortunes of city centre high streets really depends on the nature of working patterns within cities. Workers in London, even in 2024, accounted for 1 in every £5 spent in the city centre. So they really drive the demand for city centre consumption, and they provide the foundation that facilitates the high quality amenities that attract people to cities. So monitoring worker patterns and making sure that there aren't knock-on effects that are hurting high streets will be really important for policymakers looking to protect that part of our economy into the future. So those are just some of the findings from our report. It's available on our website, so please do check it out if you want any further detail. But other than that, I'll hand back over to Andrew and Paul and let them discuss this and the broader implications of COVID on our economy.
Great, thanks very much, Oscar. That's really helpful. As I say, you can get the briefing on our website, centreforcities.org, where you can go through all the detail. But a question from Sean as to where we got the data. The data comes from card transaction data, Sean. So if you go onto the website and look in the briefing, it'll give you a kind of brief explanation as to the data source that we are using in order to do the analysis that Oscar's just run us through. So that's your answer, I hope. If you've got other questions, either for us on what Oscar's done or more generally now, because I think we're going to have a conversation about the briefing, but also a broader conversation about, say, about other work that we've been doing, but also the broader conversation about where cities are, where they have been, and where they're likely to be. Then again, use the Q&A function, put them in, and we'll get to them through the next half an hour or so. Paul, welcome.
Hello.
Good to see you. So as Oscar said, this is the latest in a body of work that we've been doing, really monitoring and looking at what's been going on over the last 5 years. And there has been quite a dramatic sort of changes over a relatively 5-year period, but maybe not quite as dramatic as some of those initial early day commentary that suggested that things were catastrophic and the changes would be huge and prolonged and permanent. So just without opening old wounds, take us back a little bit, remind us a little bit of those days, and then I guess there's a kind of question about the progression as to where we are now and what that might suggest on a number of different fronts going forward.
Definitely. So yeah, let's cast our minds back to sort of April, May, June 2020, as long as that doesn't bring on PTSD to anybody. But certainly if we were there, we wouldn't be sitting this close together. That's for sure. And it was a very interesting time. I think there's been a whole load of change that has happened over these last 5 years. But actually, the question is not what was the volume of change, but where we ended up at, or where are we currently, and then what's that then mean for the future as well. And reflecting back on those times, I think there were 3 claims that were made in newspapers and certainly conversations that we had with journalists. The first one was that the office is dead. COVID's killed the office. Everyone's going to work remotely forever. The second one is that the high street or city centre high street is dead, and this is going to be fantastic for local high streets instead, because people are going to go out and spend locally rather than spending in their city centre. And that will also be this mass exodus from cities too, in terms of people living. So that's how we work, how we spend our leisure time, and where we live. And I think the way the narrative has shifted on this, I think it's been as interesting as actually what has happened, because in 2020 this was the prevailing idea, and we were all going to work from home forever. Then sort of going through the period, I think it was interesting when we did or said something on this in 2021 about the world of work maybe in the future not looking too different than what it did in 2019, certainly relative to where we were in 2020. There was quite a strong backlash, I think, that we got when we made those comments, and there was a real sort of identity issue almost around this, that the office is dead, we're never going back, we're being freed from the yoke of being in the office, and there was a big sort of I say pushback on that. But I think it's interesting in terms of how we've the reaction that we've had, I think the nature of the discourse over the period 2022, 2023, 2024 and up to now, about how that conversation has changed as we've been talking about these things. And certainly I think the response has been much less there's been much less of a pushback in terms of when we've been talking about the things or the evolving pattern of what's been going on. And I think it's much more accepted now that clearly we're at least, at the very least, in a hybrid working world, which is 3 days a week, rather than the fully remote world, which is what people were predicting. And must say, predicting out from a crisis when predicting that as well, which is never a good place to start. But very much a change, I think, in the narrative around that in particular. And I think that change in hybrid working has then had implications for then spending, as Oscar was talking about, but also in terms of where people choose to live as well. And a lot of change we suspect in that field too.
Yeah, it's and as we've shown in lots of our work in various ways, we're not suggesting that we are currently back at 100% in the sense that old patterns and the old ways of doing things. We're not simply saying that they are already back, and we're not even saying that they will fully come back. We're not suggesting that, in part because we just don't know. I think what we are saying is that there's a progression, although some of it seems to have plateaued for a time being. Just getting to say something on that, and things have changed, but maybe not necessarily in the way that we originally anticipated, particularly when it was often thought about, as you said, as a vehicle to achieve redistribution of activity and people from cities particularly into other parts of the country.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. And I think the that trajectory point, I think, is important, is to think about what has happened in the last few years and what does that then tell us about the future. So in terms of then what has happened, and Andrew, you said some of this at the start, but if we go through the 3 challenges or 3 predictions that people made. So first off was that the office was dead. We've done a number of pieces of work now, and Oscar was showing some of this to show that that very much isn't the case. Working patterns do look different now to what they did in 2019, but there's been a gradual return to the office, which has probably plateaued a little bit more recently, and has hovered around sort of Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Thursdays, and people going in, which are fairly close to pre-pandemic patterns, whereas Mondays and Fridays much less so. As you suggested, Andrew, and as Oscar alluded to, that does seem in central London plateaued recently. We'll be doing a blog, or Oscar will be doing a blog on that in the coming days to sort of show the numbers on that. But there has been this return to the office. Second then, in terms of spending locally, well, certainly hybrid working seems to have influenced the patterns of where workers choose to spend, so the knock-on impact on the high street of these changes in patterns. But interestingly, as Oscar showed, the increase, if there has been an increase in local spending, has been pretty small. And certainly it isn't the case that all the spending that was happening in city centres, or share of spending that's happening in city centres, was transferred to the local neighbourhood. This idea that people are going to go out and buy their coffee on the local high street during the day when they were working, it just at home, just doesn't seem to have come to pass, which in reality makes sense. If you're embracing a digital world through work, then why all of a sudden would you be getting up and getting your car to drive down to a high street rather than making your orders online as well, embracing the digital element from your leisure time as well. So it always felt like a bit of a big claim, and it certainly hasn't come to pass the way that people were saying. And the third one, in terms of this exodus of leaving cities, we did some work on this last year, but helpfully the ONS hasn't updated its migration stats, so we haven't got the latest picture on this. Hopefully that will be resolved soon. Watch this space. But even when we were able to look at the data up to 2021, what we saw was that there was a big shock in 2020 of, yes, this space race did seem to be happening. people were leaving London in even more higher numbers, and to a degree other large cities, than what they'd done in the past. But the patterns were exactly the same, and that they would go to the home counties, they weren't going off to the Highlands or wherever, or West Wales, or wherever it is that some people were claiming, and the levelling up implications that that might then have. And certainly indications since have suggested that this was a one-off hit, and that there's then been this return to people wanting to live in big cities in particular, and the overall population stats seem to suggest that.
Yeah, and one of the other areas we're interested in doing some more detailed work, looking at in more detail about the changing patterns particularly in our big cities. So the briefing is a sort of first foray into that, but we're going to try and do a bit more of that over the next few months. One of the things that we did do, we're also looking maybe to update it, is actually how, I suppose, London compared to some other global cities. We looked at New York, we looked at Paris, we looked at Toronto, we looked at Sydney, and the patterns are different but similar, right? I mean, in a sense, so that you can see different patterns going on in different places. So it's probably just worth putting a bit of an international context on that. We're not saying that, again, the patterns that we see in London are the same as Manchester or Barnsley or Burnley in Britain, but they are reasonably similar to what we see in other big cities in other parts of the world.
Yeah, so we last year we ran a survey looking at workers in central London and compared them to Singapore, Toronto, New York, Sydney and Paris. I think I've got all of them there. I always end up missing one out to look at those patterns. And as you say, Andrew, I think what we saw across those 6 cities is that there had been a return to office working. It was Tuesdays to Thursdays tended to be the most popular days where that had happened too. And we're able to get to the reasons to why that had happened as well. And I think, this held out universally across all cities, was that there was an acceptance that being in the office was of benefit. That, again, the idea that I think that was prevailing in 2020 was that we were all forced into the office, and really, particularly if you were office-based, all you needed was your brain and your computer, and off you go as a maverick, as an Einstein almost, independent genius. You're going to figure all these things out on your own. Whereas the reality is that it just isn't how we work. There is a benefit to face-to-face interaction through sharing of ideas and information, through hearing colleagues talking about something and saying, hang on, I've just had a conversation about that with somebody else. Have you tried doing this? And pushing on organisations like that. And there's also a benefit, I think, from on-the-job learning as well, because if you're somebody starting out in your career, and you're sat in a back room and not really having any interaction with anybody beyond your scheduled calls at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday or 4 o'clock on a Thursday, you're not hearing all the information that flies around an office about seeing how does your boss deal with situation X, or how do they deal with situation Y, or how has somebody received that information that is being conveyed face to face rather than necessarily via electronic forms, which I think is a big element of how people do go about learning. I think there's also an element too about how you try and influence decisions. There's a famous song in Hamilton, which is the musical, which is "I want to be in the room where it happens." And I think working remotely, you're not in the room where it happens, with the ability to influence decision making. And when we surveyed workers about that and said, well, is there a benefit to office working? Only 5% of people said that they didn't think there was any benefit to being in an office. Yeah. Now, that might not sound as very controversial now, but if we told you that in 2020, that's what the response would be in 2024, nobody would have believed you, because of this idea that it's just me and my computer and that's all I need. I don't need my colleagues. There's no value of the team working. So that was very interesting that they had said that, and the key things coming out that were value of face-to-face interaction, building social ties, etc. were quite big reasons. Now that's important, I think, because a lot of the discussion still has been about office mandates, or companies forcing people back, that companies see that there's some value to having people in the room, but employees don't. This survey showed that wasn't the case. And again, that was something that held across the 6 international cities. It wasn't just a London thing. Now, I guess the question then is what were the differences in terms of the return to work? Mm-hmm. And what we saw was that despite universal patterns, understanding of benefits of office working, Central London was definitely lagging behind in terms of that return to the office. It was at 2.7 days of office working in London, central London on average. In Paris, the leader, it was 3.5 days. Now, that gets us into the realm of what does that then mean for the future, and is this a good thing or a bad thing? I think it's a very interesting question that if there is a benefit of that face-to-face interaction, if it does let colleagues get on in their careers, it does allow them to pick up more skills and information, it does allow companies to innovate more by being in the office more. It's a question then about what the competitive challenge starts to look like if Parisian workers are in the office more than workers in London, and the impact on both of those economies.
Yeah, and I think, you know, it touches on, we'll come on to, I think, just some reflections on, you know, how cities themselves have sort of engaged with this, you know, these patterns and these trends and what they're now thinking about, which I can say something about in a second. But it's quite interesting, and the briefing sort of touches on this a little bit. You can also see the way that people think about cities as places of work, you know, where they go to do their work, but also where they go to enjoy themselves.
Yeah.
And we saw that almost immediately after lockdown, because we were tracking for a very long time. We were tracking footfall in our city centres and differentiating between different days, different times of the day, the weekend and the weekday. And you could quite noticeably see almost across every place that the consumption, the weekend sort of recovery, the evening recovery was much stronger immediately than the weekday, the working week recovery. And that's pretty much still true today in some respects. You saw a little bit in the briefing, you know, that the weekend allure of cities, you know, is still very strong. People want to go into them for entertainment, for enjoyment. The reason I say that is because that's quite interesting. But it also just reminds us, and actually there are policy implications for that, about how we think about the role that our cities play more generally, not just in as centres of production, centres of work in an office sense, but actually centres of activity, entertainment, engagement, etc.
Yeah, and I think that probably drove quite a lot of the policy conversation actually over the last couple of years, which is how will the high streets bounce back from COVID? What can we do to be supporting high streets? And certainly in London, I think a lot of the focus of the Mayor of London has been around how do we get London is open, but that was very much about coming to have a good time in London. Now, I think that recognises, as you say, Andrew, the role that cities play, not just as places of production, but actually places of leisure time. And indeed, I think probably it was quite interesting how quickly people were willing to embrace that leisure element after COVID. There certainly didn't seem to be a great deal of reticence once vaccines were in place and restrictions were lifted for people there to come back and have a good time in the centre of these places, especially on weekends. And that's certainly what the data showed. Perhaps sort of less enthusiastic in embracing the office, certainly to start off with, which is quite interesting in itself. But I think it's interesting that I think the policy element is focused around that high street stuff and hasn't really focused so much on the impact of office working and hybrid working on the city centre as a place of production, and that potential loss you might get of lack of collaboration, lack of sharing of ideas, and what longer term costs that might build up. So I think politicians tend to focus on the sort of shops, bars and cafes bit because it's very real and it's right there in front of you. Is the shop open or is it closed? Is the restaurant busy or is it not busy? Are people standing outside of the pub on Friday night socialising after work, or are they not? Much less still, I think, about the potential long-term productivity implications of this sort of thing and what that might mean for our city centres, but also therefore for cities as a whole. And I think there's still something for politicians to be thinking about and potentially concerned about if it is the case that we have now finally found the new normal at around 75% of pre-COVID patterns going in around about 3 days a week. Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? I don't think we have much of a discussion about that.
Yeah. I'm going to continue that theme on. But a question, Oscar touched on it in his presentation, so it might be that we haven't disaggregated to a great degree. But just so Lenka's asked the question about, we grouped the large cities together outside of London. Oscar gave a sort of sense as to why that was, so we could get some bigger numbers. But did we see, if we disaggregate, do we see noticeable differences between a Manchester and a Birmingham and a Leeds and a Liverpool and such, or are the trends broadly similar, you know, with London being slightly different?
Yeah, they're actually remarkably similar when you break it down. And so as Oscar said, because the sample sizes get a bit smaller, and from a presentation perspective, it was a bit easier to present all large cities as one. But if you go through the spreadsheet and look at the individual charts, the chart that Oscar showed you in terms of large city pretty much is exactly the same for every individual large city as it is for the group. And so I guess that very much makes London an outlier in that respect, in terms of it is behaving actually quite differently to those other places, which suggests that we haven't got the data, unfortunately, for the return to the office in other large cities. It would be something we'd love to do, but we need to get that sponsored before we can do that because of the cost of the survey work. There's a nice plug there. But certainly would suggest that whatever is happening specifically within those large cities from a hybrid working perspective, it is a shared experience across them.
Yeah, I agree with that. So that's the answer, Lingy. You can find a bit more detail on the website in the briefing itself and the related material. Come back to the sort of policy question. I mean, one of the great things about the job and work in centre cities is we get to interact with lots of places around the country, get to go to lots of those places, see what's going on. I'd be interested in your observation. I think it's been quite interesting to watch how places have responded to 2020 and then what came of it. And I'd say one thing which you see now more and more in places, which is slightly surprising, particularly if you think back to 2020, was when you talk to them about their growth ambitions or their growth plans, however they think about them, more and more places, big and small, are recognizing that their city centres, their town centres, play an outsized role in their economy. They recognize that there is something special and different, or should be something special and different about their city and town centres relative to other bits of their place, as it were. And I think that's quite an interesting observation. So, whatever COVID did, it hasn't sort of diluted that emphasis and specificness. The second thing I'd say is that increasingly places are also thinking about how they provide workspace, which is more broadly defined maybe than it historically was. It's not just an office. I think you see that in some places, but actually more places thinking about what is it that businesses that typically want to be in our city and town centres, what kind of space do they need, what kind of terms do they need it on. It's not the traditional 5-year lease anymore. It's much more flexible. It's a communal hub as much as an individual hub. I think that's been quite noticeable in the way that we've seen that over the last few years. And the third point, which it touches on the conversation about the consumption, I think more and more places are recognising that actually part of the problem in the past, even before COVID, and certainly during COVID, is that they had too much retail relative to everything else. And actually part of the response to COVID and to the patterns that we've seen is actually to move away from retail, to actually reduce the amount of retail in places, and actually to increase other uses, more broadly defined, that encourage people in to come and either spend time or to spend part of their working week and the weekend. All of that is sort of happening anyway, but they're kind of interesting sort of policy responses that, as I say, you see in big places and small places up and down the country. I don't know what you think about that, Paul.
Yeah, I think it certainly has led to a reflection on what it is that town and city centres are for and what function they provide. I think what was probably fairly alarming to us certainly in 2020 and 2021 was the idea that people aren't going to go into these centres anymore, and that will have to change their use. And again, the conversation that was being had during that time, the policy conversation during that time, was that, people aren't going to go and work in city centres anymore. So what we should do is we should put more residential in them. And people aren't going to work in city centres anymore. So all of a sudden, that transport infrastructure project that we were going to do, we should cancel that now. And it's like, again, you're projecting out from a crisis, and we don't think this is where this is going to settle. Now, the challenge for both those, or the implication for both those things, was obvious, was that if you then convert commercial into residential, that's a thing you can do quite fairly quickly, but trying to unpick that becomes very, very difficult if there is this return to businesses once again showing a very strong, high-skilled businesses showing a very strong preference for a city centre location. Fortunately, that didn't come to pass, and I think, as you were describing there, Andrew, cities have now moved through that and recognise there's still a role to play for, which probably looks much more like it did in 2019 than what it was that people were predicting in 2020. The transport infrastructure discussions, I think, are happening again, and so announcements around Leeds Tram Leeds Metro not so long ago, are very welcome in a way that I think in 2020 we probably would say, oh, hang on, maybe we're not going to do that anymore. Getting people into the centre of Leeds from a work perspective as well as a leisure perspective is going to continue to be very, very important for how people spend their lives, but also, or their leisure time, but also sort of for UK PLC too. So even the arc of conversation in that space, I think it's been interesting to see how it has developed. And we've broadly got back to where we were probably in 2019, with maybe some more discussion, with a bit of reflection on that, and maybe more discussion around shared workspace, etc., than what we would have had back then. But fortunately, I can't think of any drastic decisions that were taken during lockdowns, which have then had a long-term negative impact and actually mean that city centres can't respond to the ever-changing world.
Yeah, no, quite. So last call for questions. If you've got any queries or questions you want to put to us, then now's your chance. Come back to where we started from, Paul, really, in terms of, where do we think this is going? And I mean, part of the answer is we don't know, and why should we? And anybody that claims that they do definitively know, they're not. And you've already touched on, making decisions in the depths of crisis, and understandable, but nevertheless need to be careful about the durability of those sorts of choices, particularly if you can't reverse them or change track in any serious way. But as we also said, when you look across the piece, we're at the 75% sort of mark on many things: office engagement, city centre working, etc. Public transport ridership, particularly during the week, not so much at the weekend where it's much higher, but around the sort of 75–80%. It's a sort of interesting question. On the one hand, does it matter if we stay there? And obviously there are benefits to having more flexibility, etc., as we move forward. But it's a sort of interesting question about what do we think the next 12, 18, 24 months has in store, sort of steady state, incremental change, or not? Don't know really, right?
Yeah, don't. So it's interesting to look at the data in recent times on this. The best data we've got on it is ridership on the London Underground, looking at data between 6 in the morning and 10 o'clock in the morning, so that morning rush. And the chart that Oscar showed you earlier showed that there had been a quite strong return, but actually more recently into 2024, it flattened off. We've now got more up-to-date data which suggests that sort of that flatlining has continued. So are we now at that point where where this is what it'll look like going forward? I think there are probably a few things to draw from that. So Oscar's blog will split Central London out into different areas, and it's quite interesting, I think, to see that different parts of Central London have responded in different ways, and that the city, the financial district, much more working in the office throughout the week. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday most popular, but Mondays and Fridays are quite high as well. Certainly much higher than the West End, for example, where you get more advertising, creative, etc. So you get differences within London, seemingly because sectors are behaving in different ways. Question whether one part will catch up with the other part or not. Then you think you've got the international competitive pressures too. So this goes back to the surveys that we were doing across the other 5 global cities. And if it's the case that, and we don't know this, but the literature suggests that it would be the case. If it's the case that face-to-face interaction is important, it does boost productivity, more of that thing is probably a good thing. So doing it on a 5-day basis rather than 3-day basis would probably be a good thing. At the very least, if the centre of businesses in the centre of Paris are doing that more, the businesses in the centre of London, if there's a productivity impact, those businesses will start to be more successful. And then there'll be a competitive response there that will follow from London. So even though we flatline currently, we shouldn't necessarily expect that this is the where we'll settle out. Because there's dynamics that might well be going on where companies in other parts of the world are acquiring that, and there've been some fairly outspoken comments from companies like Amazon bringing people back 5 days a week. That might then have a knock-on impact, which means that we continue to see increase in work. And my estimate would be, I think Monday will continue to increase and probably look more like Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. But we seem to have sort of inadvertently coordinated around Fridays for that to be much less of an in-person day. And if one day was to stay much more remote working, I'd imagine it will be the Friday.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And I think, you know, it's I mean, admittedly, part of the conversation about hybrid and flexible working applies to a certain section of the working workforce and the working population. And for others, you know, they've never had hybrid working. The nature of their work means that as soon as lockdown ended, they were pretty much back 5 days a week or 6 days a week or whatever, you know, whatever they work. So as always, the sort of hybrid nature of it is by definition more applicable to certain bits of the workforce than it is to others. But broadly, you can see, you know, a more flexibility offered into the working situation, where, you know, not just a hybrid working from home, but actually much more variation coming as part and parcel, you know, of it anyway.
Yeah, and I think the flexibility isn't just about the ability to work from home or not work from home on certain days of the week. And I think the conversation, when you talk about the return to the office, and people say, oh, but that's a loss of my flexibility and a loss of my autonomy. Yeah. Well, flexibility actually comes through in a number of different ways, be that that you start late or you leave early on certain days to deal with childcare, for example. And being in the office doesn't mean necessarily being in the office for your 7.5 hours or whatever it is. So I don't think we should lose sight that that when we talk about return to the office, that doesn't mean people change to desks. And flexibility introduces itself a number of different ways, of which working from home on certain days may be part of that, but it certainly isn't all of it. And I don't think it's helpful when people pitch it in terms of, or you're losing flexibility by being required in the office. Well, no, flexibility can take those different forms.
Yeah, and we'll just finish on this from anonymous good comment. Going back to the point on major changes made during the pandemic, which have stuck. I would say, living and working in Manchester, that I feel there's been a positive shift regarding placemaking, shifting towards pedestrian, public transport and roads in the core, new mixed-use districts, etc., etc.
Yes.
And you can see that. This is the point. You've made that point much better than me. It's when you look at places, actually they've taken this as an opportunity to really think about how they can add value to their place, and particularly, but not exclusively, their cities and town centres as the hub of their places, and how do they make them more attractive, broadly defined, to not only to workers but also to consumers and to visitors. And that's a good thing in a sense. The details will vary place to place, but it's a broader trend about valuing the offer that places can make to different types of users, different types of consumers, different types of workers.
Yeah, and I suppose there's a bit of an irony to that, isn't there? That the discussion was in 2020 was that city centre is going to hollow out and people are not going to go and spend their leisure time there anymore because we're all going to live our lives differently. And the irony is actually what has happened. Of all the things that have stuck, the one that probably has stuck a bit more is this change in how we use space in city centres, which has then improved the product, which probably makes them even more attractive places to go and visit and spend leisure time, and hopefully have, when it's not raining, especially a challenge in Manchester, have that al fresco restaurant experience, bring your big coat, as opposed to people not going in at all. So I think that's probably the thing that would have been least predicted at the time, but the thing that maybe is so the test of time more than any of the changes that we introduced.
Yeah, and certainly chance with one of the things I said right at the beginning, that things have definitely changed, but they've often changed in ways that we couldn't foresee at the time, and are more subtle and more varied and nuanced than we would have, even if we were being reasonably sensible about some of the predictions. We still would have missed some of the ways that places themselves have then responded and taken advantage of some of these issues. On that happy note, I think we should draw it to a close. So thanks to Paul to join me with share his thoughts on the broader work that we've been doing. Big thanks to Oscar for the presentation and for leading on the pulling together of the briefing. Thank you for coming along as well. You can get all of the detail on all of the work that we've been touching on the website, centreforcities.org. But as always, until the next time, take care and stay safe. Bye for now.